Have you ever defused a ticking bomb using nothing but silence? I have. My family was built on a colossal lie, forcing me to shrink so someone else could play the hero. But truth is like groundwater. The harder you dam it up, the worse the flood. If you think the deepest betrayal comes from enemies, you have never been mocked by your own blood for cheap applause. Hold your breath. Tonight, a fake empire falls with one question. Hello? Dear listeners of Maya Revenge Stories, and thank you so much for being here with us today. Unfortunately, YouTube has recently demonetized our channel, leaving us without the budget to keep operating and paying our hardworking team. If you find today's story engaging, please consider supporting us with just $1 so our staff can afford their living expenses and continue creating more thrilling stories for you. You can help by scanning the QR code on the screen or clicking the donation link in the description or the comments section below. My name is Georgia Larson. I am 32 years old, and I live in a quiet, heavily secured apartment in the heart of Austin, Texas. To the outside world, my existence appears entirely unremarkable, and that is exactly by design. I am an inherently private person, sharp-edged in my observations, but always choosing to blend seamlessly into the background, particularly when confronted with the suffocating obligations of family gatherings. In a rapidly expanding city that thrives on loud networking, tech booms, and flashy displays of new wealth, I am the shadow in the corner of the room. I prefer to sip my sparkling water and quietly observe the grand tragicomic theater of human ego. The undisputed lead actor in this family theater has always been my older brother, Julian Larson. Julian is a sharply dressed, fast-talking businessman currently in the aggressive phase of pitching a startup he boldly calls a corporate security and risk management consulting firm. He is the eternal center of attention, a natural-born narcissist who operates purely on the high-octane fuel of our parents' endless adoration. To our mother and father, the sun rises and sets on his tailored shoulders. He is their golden child, a man who can do no wrong, constantly radiating a blinding aura of manufactured success that they proudly display to their country club friends. Then there is his soon-to-be wife, Clara Vance. Clara comes from a powerful, old-money family with a massive real estate empire stretching across the state. From the very first moment I met her, I realized she was fundamentally different from the usual superficial accessories Julian kept around. Clara possesses quiet, intensely observant eyes. She carries a heavy stillness that stands in stark, almost jarring contrast to Julian's loud, showy energy. While my brother fills every available silence with aggressive self-promotion, Clara merely watches, analyzes, and calculates. It always fascinated me that a woman of her undeniable intellect ended up engaged to someone so hollow. But generational wealth often comes with complex blind spots and strategic alliances. The dynamic between Julian and me has always been defined by a carefully constructed, silently agreed-upon illusion regarding my career. In reality, I work for Vanguard Horizon Group, a highly classified private intelligence and crisis management organization. My actual daily life involves life-or-death hostage negotiations, severe threat assessments, and diffusing catastrophic situations for global clients before the incidents ever reach the evening news. However, within the walls of my family home, I allow a completely different narrative to thrive. Julian loves to loudly proclaim to anyone who will listen that I am merely a customer service switchboard operator at a low-tier security guard company. I have never once bothered to correct him. The cover story is incredibly convenient for my line of work. It keeps my actual employer entirely off the radar and protects my mental peace. Unfortunately, my professional silence has a rather dark side effect. It feeds the toxic paradigm my family has normalized for decades. Our parents used Julian's superficial achievements as the ultimate yardstick for human value, measuring everything in dollars and titles. Whenever Julian feels the need to elevate his own status in front of wealthy investors or skeptical family friends, he uses me as his personal, pathetic backdrop. He skillfully paints me as the weak, unmotivated sister, turning my fabricated mundane life into a cruel punchline. I am the baseline of failure he uses to make his own fake success look staggering by comparison. He needs me to be small so he can feel enormous. I have grown entirely accustomed to being the family punching bag over the past 32 years. I learned a long time ago that arguing with delusions only exhausts the truth teller. But recently, the rules of his game shifted into dangerous territory. I started noticing Julian using highly specific, rudimentary industry jargon in his startup pitches. He was confidently throwing around terms like threat vector mitigation, psychological perimeter defense, and tactical de-escalation. These were not words he learned in business school. These were phrases he had eavesdropped from my late-night work calls, stripped of their true context, and weaponized to scam hardcore angel investors. He was building a massive house of cards using stolen terminology he did not even begin to understand. Instead of confronting him and causing a scene, I did what any seasoned crisis manager does. I assessed the threat level, secured my own perimeter, and chose to remain absolutely silent. I simply stood by, waiting patiently to see exactly how far his arrogance and lies would stretch before the entire structure collapsed under its own weight. I knew the storm was coming, and I knew exactly who would be left standing when the wind finally stopped howling. The air at the vineyard estate felt incredibly thick, heavy with the sweet scent of crushed grapes, overpowering designer cologne, and the invisible but undeniable weight of generational wealth. We were gathered at a sprawling, multi-million-dollar property located 45 minutes outside the city limits. A venue selected exclusively to signal massive financial power to anyone who walked through the wrought iron gates. Strings of warm, golden fairy lights hung suspended across the expansive courtyard. Reflecting off the glass surface of a massive infinity pool, servers dressed in immaculate white jackets glided silently across the pristine limestone patios, balancing heavy silver trays loaded with crystal glasses of vintage champagne that cost over $300 a single bottle. It was a picture-perfect display of excess, meticulously curated to impress the exact kind of high-net-worth individuals Julian desperately needed to fund his hollow empire. He was standing dead center under the brightest cluster of lights, holding court like a king among loyal subjects, surrounded by a tight circle of 6 prominent angel investors. Julian was entirely in his element, waving his hands wildly to emphasize his completely fabricated points about corporate resilience. I stood alone on the extreme edge of the stone balcony, leaning against the cool iron railing, sipping my plain mineral water. From my isolated vantage point, I defaulted to my actual professional training. I had already mentally mapped the 4 potential exit routes, noted the incredibly poor placement of the perimeter security guards, and identified 3 men in the crowd who were carrying concealed firearms. While I conducted a silent threat assessment, Julian was loudly lecturing these veteran financiers about the brutal psychology of facing extreme risk. He aggressively claimed that true leaders must embrace danger and run toward the fire. A rather bold and ridiculous statement from a man who once called the local police because a stray golden retriever wandered onto our front lawn. He needed a prop for his grand performance, a living foil to make his own fake bravery shine much brighter in the eyes of the wealthy men holding the checkbooks. I watched his eyes playfully scan the crowd, searching for a target, before locking directly onto me standing quietly in the shadows. He raised his right arm and pointed a perfectly manicured finger right at my chest. The entire circle of investors simultaneously turned their heads to follow his gaze. Suddenly, the protective distance of the dark balcony completely vanished, and the sparkling, glamorous atmosphere of the party rapidly shrank into a tight, suffocating spotlight aimed squarely at my face. If you want to understand the exact opposite of a hardened executive mindset, you only need to look over there, Julian announced, his voice booming effortlessly over the acoustic jazz music playing softly in the background. He offered the wealthy crowd a wide, arrogant grin. Take my little sister, for example, a person born entirely and simply to be in the background. She possesses 0 situational awareness and 0 drive. If a real, life-threatening crisis ever actually happened right here, right now, she would be completely useless. She only knows how to sit at a small desk answer a plastic headset, and log angry customer complaints for some low-rent strip mall security firm. The silence that immediately followed his speech was heavy and utterly toxic. My mother suddenly found the bottom of her expensive wine glass incredibly fascinating, completely averting her eyes to avoid making any form of visual contact with me. My father cleared his throat loudly and looked away toward the dark vineyards, implicitly endorsing my brother's public cruelty through his absolute, cowardly refusal to defend his own daughter. A few of the older investors chuckled awkwardly, sipping their drinks and shifting their weight from side to side. The public humiliation was expertly wrapped in the cowardly guise of harmless sibling banter, creating a stifling, deeply uncomfortable environment where no one dared to intervene or speak up on my behalf. I did not flinch. I did not look away or lower my head. I simply absorbed the public degradation, keeping my face locked in a carefully constructed blank mask. But then, the predictable, toxic rhythm of the night shattered. Clara was standing roughly 10 feet away from Julian, dressed in an elegant emerald green silk gown. She was not laughing. She was not even smiling politely. Her beautiful face was completely devoid of any amusement. Slowly, and with terrifying deliberation, Clara placed her half-full champagne flute onto a passing server's tray. The sharp, clear, clinking sound of the crystal hitting the silver tray cut sharply through the murmuring crowd. She turned her back on her grinning fiancé and began walking directly toward the balcony. The crowd instinctively parted for her, sensing the sudden shift in atmospheric pressure. She moved like a highly trained predator cutting through tall grass. Her eyes locked onto mine with a terrifying, razor-sharp intensity. She carried with her a deep, unsettling suspicion that seemed to have been quietly brewing under the surface for months. Clara stopped barely 2 feet in front of me, completely invading my personal space. The live jazz music seemed to fade into a dull, distant hum. The quiet, polite chatter of the wealthy partygoers completely evaporated in our immediate vicinity. Julian noticed his fiancée walking away from his big speech and let out a confused, nervous laugh, attempting to loudly call her back to his side. Clara ignored him completely. She did not even bother to glance over her shoulder. She kept her dark, calculating eyes pinned strictly to my face, rapidly scanning my perfectly straight posture, the relaxed way I held my hands at my sides, and the incredibly steady, controlled rhythm of my breathing. Clara leaned in slightly, her voice cutting through the humid Texas night air with absolute, chilling authority. Over this past period of time, I have always found your demeanor to be very strange. Your body language never matches your story. You watch the exits. You analyze the room. You never react to his provocations. I need the truth. What exactly do you really do for a living? Julian's heavy footsteps clicked sharply against the pristine limestone patio as he hurriedly closed the distance between himself and his fiancée. He could feel the collective attention of his wealthy audience slipping away from his carefully rehearsed presentation and drifting toward the dark, quiet corner of the balcony. Panic is a scent I have been trained to recognize instantly, and Julian was practically radiating it. He slid his arm possessively around Clara's waist, attempting to pull her back into the warm, flattering light of the party. He let out a loud, patronizing laugh that echoed awkwardly off the stone walls of the estate. "She just does boring paperwork, darling," Julian announced smoothly, his voice dripping with forced casualness as he tried to dismiss my entire existence with a single wave of his hand. "Come back over here with the adults. There is absolutely nothing interesting going on in her sad little administrative world." I did not even blink at his insult. I completely ignored my brother. Instead, I straightened my spine, letting go of the invisible, heavy slump I had carried around my family for over a decade. I stepped out of the shadows, closing the final gap between Clara and myself. I looked directly into her dark, searching eyes. It was time to pull the pin on the grenade. I engaged my diaphragm, dropping the soft, submissive pitch I always used at home. I summoned the exact voice I utilize when a human life hangs by a thread. It is a highly calibrated instrument. It is deep, resonant, entirely devoid of panic, and designed to cut through the most chaotic, terrifying noise in the world. I locked eyes with Clara and enunciated every single syllable with absolute, undeniable authority. I am a senior kidnapping and crisis negotiation specialist for Vanguard Horizon Group. The effect was instantaneous and entirely devastating. The warm, sparkling atmosphere of the vineyard courtyard practically froze solid. Clara did not react to the prestigious title or the name of the covert organization. She reacted to the frequency. She reacted to the precise, measured cadence of my voice. All the color rapidly drained from her face, leaving her looking like a marble statue bathed in the harsh security lights. Her jaw dropped slightly, and her entire body began to tremble violently. Her hands, which had been so steady and elegant all evening, shook so hard she had to grip the heavy folds of her emerald silk dress just to remain standing. The past violently crashed into the present. I watched the realization detonate behind her eyes. She took a slow, unsteady step backward, her breath hitching as hot tears instantly welled up and spilled over her eyelashes. "The bank robbery and the 3-day hostage situation in Seattle last year," Clara whispered, her voice cracking as the suppressed trauma clawed its way to the surface. "The woman on the tactical radio, the one who kept me entirely sane when a loaded gun was pressed directly against my head. Was that you?" I held her gaze, offering her the same steady, unbreakable presence I had offered her through an earpiece when she was trapped inside a freezing concrete vault for 72 agonizing hours. I nodded slowly. Then, I gently spoke the secret, deeply guarded middle name she had whispered to me in the dark, a name she told me to pass on to her mother if she did not make it out alive. "Yes, Evangeline, I promised I would get you out of that vault, and I always keep my promises." The sprawling, luxurious garden plunged into a dead, suffocating silence. It was the kind of heavy, absolute quiet that only exists in the immediate aftermath of a massive explosion. The crickets seemed to stop chirping. The distant jazz music faded into irrelevance. The wealthy investors, who had been chuckling at my expense just 2 minutes prior, stood completely paralyzed, their expensive champagne glasses suspended in midair. My mother covered her mouth with trembling hands, and my father looked as though he had just been struck by lightning. Clara snapped her head away from me and turned back to face Julian. The tears streaming down her cheeks were no longer born of trauma. They were fueled by pure, unadulterated fury. Her eyes blazed with a terrifying, destructive fire that made my brother physically recoil. "You dare to call the exact woman who pulled me away from death's door useless?" Clara demanded, her voice rising to a fierce, commanding shout that echoed across the entire estate. "You stand there and mock her, while you did not even have the courage to watch the news broadcast that year, because you were entirely too terrified." Julian opened his mouth to speak, but his jaw just moved silently, completely devoid of his usual silver-tongued arrogance. The charming, untouchable armor he had worn his entire life was suddenly shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The investors were staring at him, not with the admiration he so desperately craved, but with profound, undisguised disgust. They were doing the math. They were connecting the blatant lies he had told them about his security expertise with the horrifying reality of his cowardice. In less than 60 seconds, the power dynamic of our entire family history had been violently flipped upside down. I did not have to raise my voice. I did not have to insult him back. I just had to step into the light and let the undeniable weight of the truth crush his pathetic, hollow empire. The silence stretched on, heavier and more punishing than any weapon, while Julian Larson stood exposed in front of the most powerful people in Texas, completely stripped of his pride and slowly drowning in his own lies. Julian stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes scraping awkwardly against the stone. The immaculate, confident posture he had maintained all evening completely evaporated. He raised his hands defensively, his face flushed with a desperate, ugly panic. "Clara, wait. Please listen to me," he stammered, the smooth cadence of his voice replaced by a pathetic, reedy whine. "I had no idea. I swear to you, I did not know anything about this. She lied to me. She intentionally hid her career from her own family just to embarrass me in front of everyone. It was the worst possible defense he could have mustered. In a courtyard filled with the most ruthless venture capitalists and seasoned executives in the city, whining and shifting the blame to a sibling was the ultimate display of weakness. The elite crowd did not look at him with sympathy. They looked at him with profound, icy contempt. A tall, silver-haired man in a bespoke navy suit stepped forward, separating himself from the tight circle of angel investors Julian had been courting all night. He was the lead backer, a man who controlled hundreds of millions of dollars in venture capital. His eyes were narrowed, calculating the catastrophic liability standing in front of him. "Let me get this straight, Julian," the investor said, his tone dangerously low and perfectly even. "For the past 6 months, you have been securing our capital by repeatedly assuring us that you had a top-tier, highly classified security expert operating as your silent partner. You explicitly told my board that this phantom consultant was your own flesh and blood, someone whose unparalleled expertise would be the absolute backbone of your firm. You used her resume, or whatever fragments you managed to eavesdrop on, to validate your entire business model." The investor scoffed, adjusting his cuffs with terrifying calm. "But you do not have her backing at all, do you? You do not even know what she actually does. You leveraged a relationship that does not exist. Every single dollar my firm pledged to your venture is officially revoked as of this exact second. I will personally ensure you are blacklisted across this entire state by morning. You are nothing but a fraud wearing a very expensive suit." Julian opened his mouth, desperately searching for a lifeline, but the investor simply turned his back on him, signaling the instant, brutal death of Julian's corporate ambitions. The startup was officially dead before it even launched. Clara did not scream. She did not throw her drink or create the kind of dramatic, hysterical scene that high society gossip columns thrived on. Her anger had crystallized into something far more dangerous. It was absolute clarity. She looked at Julian not with rage, but with the cold, clinical disgust one might reserve for a crushed insect. Slowly, she reached for her left hand. With a smooth, deliberate motion, she slid the massive, 5-carat diamond engagement ring off her finger. The heavy platinum band caught the golden light of the patio as she stepped forward and placed it gently onto the surface of a nearby wrought iron table. The quiet click of the metal against the glass top sounded like a heavy gavel dropping in a silent courtroom. "I will not marry a parasite," Clara stated, her voice steady and carrying clearly across the hushed garden. "I will never bind my life to a man who builds his fragile ego by leeching off the quiet greatness of others, only to turn around and trample them for cheap applause. You are entirely hollow. Julian, we are done." She did not wait for his response. Clara simply turned and began walking toward the main house, her head held high, leaving the expensive ring glittering abandoned in the dark. I glanced briefly at my parents. They were standing frozen near the lavish buffet table, completely paralyzed by the sudden, spectacular implosion of their favorite child. For decades, they had poured all their pride, money, and affection into a hollow vessel, deliberately ignoring me in the process. Now, the grand illusion was shattered. They were forced to look at their golden boy and see him for exactly what he was, while simultaneously realizing the daughter they had discarded as a failure was the only actual hero in the room. My mother's eyes met mine for a fraction of a second, filled with a sickening mix of shame and disbelief, but I did not offer her a single ounce of comfort. There was no need for me to gloat. There was no need to deliver a triumphant speech or demand an apology. True power does not require a megaphone. I calmly picked up my dark wool coat from the back of a chair, draped it over my arm, and walked toward the exit. The crowd parted for me in absolute, reverent silence. I left Julian standing alone in the ruins of his own making, knowing that the truth had already exacted a far more devastating revenge than I ever could. Exactly 3 days after the disastrous engagement party, my phone rang. It was my mother, her voice thin and frantic. demanding my immediate presence at my childhood home for an emergency family meeting. I arrived at the sprawling suburban house just after 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The atmosphere inside the living room was incredibly suffocating, thick with the smell of stale coffee and the unmistakable, metallic scent of sheer panic. Julian was practically unrecognizable. The perfectly tailored suits and arrogant smirk were completely gone. He was wearing wrinkled sweatpants, pacing frantically back and forth across the expensive Persian rug. The heavy oak coffee table was entirely buried under a mountain of thick legal documents, formal termination notices, and canceled contracts. His perfectly manicured hands were running wildly through his unstyled hair as he muttered incoherently to himself. The financial fallout from that single night had been absolute and devastating. Within 48 hours, the primary venture capital fund had officially pulled every single cent of their backing. The formal withdrawal letter, which was currently sitting on the top of the pile, cited the exact reason for the termination. It read, "In cold, unforgiving legal terms, termination, due to severe personal ethical dishonesty and the fraudulent impersonation of a crisis management partnership, because his entire business model relied on the false promise of my highly classified expertise. The loss of that anchor investor triggered a massive domino effect. Every other minor backer fled immediately. His grand corporate security startup was completely bankrupt before it ever officially launched. Cornered and fighting for his corporate survival, Julian did the only thing he knew how to do. He lashed out. He stopped pacing, turned his bloodshot eyes toward me, and started screaming. "You planned this," he yelled, his voice cracking with desperate, ugly rage. "You deliberately set a trap for me. You sat there for months, knowing exactly what I was pitching, and you purposely chose the most important night of my entire life to completely humiliate me. You are so violently jealous of my success, of my ability to actually shine in the real world, that you had to destroy it. You could have pulled me aside. You could have warned me." I simply sat back in the deep leather armchair, holding a warm mug of black coffee, and watched him unravel. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. Before I could even formulate a response, an absolutely unprecedented event occurred. My father, a man who had spent the last 3 decades silently enabling my brother's every delusion, violently slammed his open palm against the heavy oak table. The loud crack echoed through the silent room, causing my mother to jump in her seat. "Shut your mouth, Julian," my father roared, his face turning a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. "For once in your miserable life, take responsibility for your own actions. She did not lie to those investors. You did. She did not mock her own flesh and blood in front of half the city. You did." My father slumped back into his chair, suddenly looking incredibly old and defeated. He rubbed his temples, his voice dropping into a heavy, regretful whisper. "We did this. Your mother and I created a monster. We fed your delusions of grandeur. We let you treat your sister like dirt because it was easier than dealing with your fragile ego. And now, you have ruined everything entirely on your own." Julian looked as though he had been physically struck. The golden child had just been disowned by his most loyal audience. Desperation completely overtook his anger. He fell to his knees in front of my chair, his hands shaking as he reached out toward me. "Georgia, please," he begged, tears streaming down his face. "You have to fix this. You have the credentials. Just make one phone call to the lead investor. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them we really are partners. If you do not vouch for me, I will lose the apartment, the cars, everything." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, feeling the warm liquid slide down my throat. I looked down at the pathetic shell of a man sobbing on the rug. "I negotiate with terrorists and kidnappers to save human lives," I said, my voice quiet and completely devoid of emotion. "I build trust with people holding loaded weapons. My word is the only thing keeping innocent people breathing. I will absolutely never use my reputation to save a garbage company built on lies. You are on your own." Just as the silence settled over the devastated room, a sharp chime echoed from my father's laptop on the desk. He opened it, his eyes scanning the screen before widening in shock. It was an email from Clara, sent directly to every member of the Larson family. My father read the words aloud, his voice trembling. Clara officially announced the permanent cancellation of the engagement, but the email contained a brutal ultimatum. Her family's legal team had drafted a massive lawsuit against Julian for the unauthorized exploitation of her name and her family's reputation to secure his fraudulent funding. The lawsuit would financially ruin him for the rest of his life. However, Clara offered exactly one condition to drop the charges. Julian had to stand up at the upcoming annual charity gala for the Austin Business Association and deliver a full public apology to me. He had to confess his lies in front of the exact same elite society he so desperately wanted to rule. He had to tear off his own mask or spend the next 20 years in a courtroom. The trap was perfectly set, and there was absolutely no way out. Exactly 6 weeks later, the annual fundraising gala for the Austin Business Association took place inside the cavernous, gold-leafed ballroom of the city's most prestigious downtown hotel. The room was packed with hundreds of the wealthiest and most influential figures in the state. Under the blinding light of 3 massive crystal chandeliers, the clinking of heavy silverware and the low hum of powerful networking filled the air. But I was not there to blend into the background, and I was not there to hide. I sat perfectly straight at a prime table near the front, wearing a sharp, tailored black suit, calmly waiting for the final act of this tragedy to unfold. Julian looked entirely hollow when he finally approached the stage. In just 42 days, he had lost absolutely everything. The luxury high-rise apartment had been foreclosed on. His startup was completely liquidated. His powerful fiancé had vanished from his life, taking her family's massive influence and wealth with her. He was no longer the golden child or the arrogant businessman. He looked small, defeated, and deeply exhausted. He stepped up to the heavy wooden podium and adjusted the microphone. The high-pitched squeal of the audio equipment immediately silenced the entire ballroom. Hundreds of expectant eyes turned toward him. Julian reached into the pocket of his faded suit jacket and pulled out a single, crumpled sheet of paper. His hands were visibly shaking. He took a deep, jagged breath and looked directly at the crowd. "Good evening," Julian began, his voice completely stripped of its usual smooth, commanding tone. It sounded fragile and broken. "I requested 3 minutes of your time tonight not to pitch a company, but to issue a formal, public confession. For the past year, I have lied to this entire community. I built a fraudulent business model on the back of stolen credentials, pretending to have security expertise I do not possess." He paused, swallowing hard, before forcing himself to look down at where I was sitting. "More importantly, I am here to apologize to my younger sister, Georgia Larson," he continued, his voice trembling even more violently. "For my entire life, I have deliberately mocked her, belittled her, and used her as a punchline to mask my own deep insecurities and glaring incompetence. I told you all she was a useless switchboard operator. That was a lie. Georgia is a senior kidnapping and crisis negotiation specialist, while I was busy playing dress-up and begging for your money. She has been quietly saving human lives in the most dangerous situations imaginable. She is the hero I only pretended to be, and I am entirely sorry for the terrible way I have treated her." The moment those words left his mouth, the final knot of our toxic family dynamic completely unraveled. By voluntarily stepping into the light and tearing off his own mask in front of the exact high society he worshipped, Julian shattered all of his illusions of power. The public admission was raw, humiliating, and undeniably final. Absolute justice was finally served, not through vengeance, but through the devastating weight of the truth. The silence in the ballroom was profound. As the gravity of his confession sank in, the atmosphere shifted from shock to a deep, heavy solemnity. I glanced over at my parents sitting 2 tables away. Tears were streaming freely down both of their faces. In that brutal moment of clarity, they finally realized the massive scale of the injustice I had suffered under their roof, and the incredible weight I had carried alone while they worshipped a mirage. When Julian stepped down from the stage, looking like a ghost drained of its soul, he slowly walked toward my table. He stood there for a moment, waiting, but I did not stand up. I did not offer him a warm embrace, and I did not utter a single word of hollow forgiveness. I simply looked him in the eye and gave him one firm, stoic nod. The apology was acknowledged, and the transaction was entirely complete. There was no need for forced sentimentality. Reality had leveled the playing field, and that was more than enough. As the evening progressed, a steady stream of highly influential business leaders, veteran investors, and city officials approached my table. They reached out to shake my hand, offering their deep respect and genuine admiration for the silent, critical work I do. The very next morning, I walked through the heavy security doors of the Vanguard Horizon Group headquarters. The air felt remarkably different. I realized that my posture had changed. I was no longer slouching my shoulders to make myself smaller, and I was no longer averting my eyes to avoid taking up space. I had spent my entire career pulling desperate people out of life-threatening hostage situations, but I finally understood that giving up the habit of shrinking myself for the comfort of others was the greatest rescue mission I had ever executed. Respect cannot be borrowed, and true heroes never need to roar. When someone deliberately plunges you into the darkness to make themselves look brighter, do not waste your breath trying to argue with them. Just stay quiet, hold your ground, and keep doing your work, because eventually, the light always turns back on, and when it does, the liar's own shadow will automatically swallow him whole. Thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for tuning in and listening to this story today on Maya Revenge Stories. I would love to know where you are listening from, so please let me know in the comments below. As I mentioned earlier, our channel is currently entirely demonetized by YouTube, and we are struggling to keep the lights on. If you felt moved by today's story and want to help our team continue creating great content, please consider supporting us with just $1. This small contribution goes directly toward paying our hardworking staff so they can feed their families. You can donate by scanning the QR code currently on your screen, or by clicking the donation link provided in the video description or the pinned comment. Thank you again for your incredible support, and have a wonderful day.